Mr. Naveen Unni, partner leader in sustainability practice at McKinsey Company, and he will share his perspective on sustainability in operations. So welcome, Mr. Unni, and the stage is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Naveen. Thank you. And thank you also to Shirish and the IPF for inviting me at this very August gathering. It's a really interesting topic because sustainability has now moved from the fringes of the corporate world to now becoming a buzzword for bankers and board members alike. As a multi-billion-dollar ESG rating industry has just been created from scratch over the last few years, there is a lot of confusion, and as much confusion as there is clarity around what sustainability is and what should not. So my purpose in the next is to show how Indian pharma companies could drive a holistic framework to sustainability in your organizations and find some practices for you to apply, whether you're staying more towards your company's sustainability goals. And probably let's start with defining sustainability. We look at the ops, look at the dimensions and around three dimensions that drive ESG. So you can network. I want to make sure the network is okay before I continue.
Yeah, Mr. Unni, I think we are facing some bandwidth issue. Would you like to switch off your video? I think that would help.
I'm going to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Is this better? Can you hear me now? Thank you so much. Thank you. So let's start a little bit with understanding what is sustainability in pharma ops. And you should excuse a consultant's charts. There's always a lot in there. So this actually may be better for me to go through some of this content. But we look at three dimensions, right? We look at environment, social, and governance to cover the entire aspect of, or the gamut of sustainability. And so environment starts with how you decarbonize, so your operations and how you think about where the carbon goes in. So typically in a pharma operation, a large part of that would be what we call scope 2, which is around the power you need to run your plant, and whether that power comes from a fossil fuel source or from a renewable source, right? So how do you decarbonize that? You could also look at scope 3, which is which is outside your factory gate, both the materials you receive as well as your suppliers and the supply chain that you rely on, and what is the carbon footprint of that entire chain. So that typically tends to be the biggest part when you think of sustainability globally. That tends to be the biggest aspect of sustainability that's spoken about, especially internationally, given the climate change crisis we're in the middle of. But at least in India, we find that the definition has to be significantly broader, and I'll come to the other aspects of that. Even within environment, there's waste, and how do you eliminate waste? There's water consumption, especially in India, water consumption, and I'm sure many of you have plants in water-stressed areas. You know how critical good water is for your operations. And then finally, there's biodiversity, the impact of your operations on the biodiversity of your surrounding region. In emerging markets, and especially in India, I think the social aspect of it is equally important. And social, from a pharma ops perspective, both covers your customers, the patients, the people who need the pharmaceuticals that you manufacture and you provide. And how do you do that in a way that you maximize health equity? As Dr. Singh was talking about at the conclusion of the last session, there's a real drive that it has to be affordable, and that affordability and making sure that equity is provided is equally important to us. But outside of that, there's also the communities that you operate in. So if you are operating in a community and the water of that community is impacted while your plant is running, that has a social impact. And increasingly over the last 10, 20 years, it's been unacceptable to have that kind of impact in our community. So the communities we operate in have to be thriving. And finally, in our own operations, how's the health and safety of our people? And are they doing well? So social has multiple aspects, but the broad impact on society is covered in social. And then finally, governance. We talked about one type of risk, which is the epidemic risk, but climate change risk, and how do we mitigate against that? Where if there are extreme weather events like floods, how do we think about that? How resilient are we in the face of big risks? Is the first dimension of governance. But there's also around diversity and inclusion and purpose-driven governance, and there's cybersecurity. How well secured is your data, and how well kept is that data? And finally, how transparent is your ESG performance to the world? So if you think of from a pharma ops perspective, there's multiple dimensions of sustainability, which makes sustainability a really interesting topic because it doesn't touch upon just one branch or one function. It touches upon ops, it touches upon HR, it touches upon external affairs and communication, finance. There is almost no area of an organization's operations or functions that sustainability doesn't touch upon. But equally, sustainability is a bit like quality or like safety. It's one of those things that everyone knows is good to have. We know when we don't have it, but it's not always clear how we get it. And so, if this definition is reasonably well understood and agreed on, then we can move to a little bit of understanding how are we doing against it right now. Next slide, please. The Dow Jones Sustainability Index is an index of companies that where companies are rated against their sustainability performance on a set of metrics that are collected from companies and then rated against their peers. Right? It's been going on for about 20 to 23 years now, and now it's really gained currency, and it's become quite a popular tool. There is a Dow Jones Sustainability Emerging Markets Index, in which there are about 109 companies. There are 15 Indian companies in that list, and of those 15, there are 4 Indian pharma companies, the companies you see on the left. That number has doubled over the last 3 years. There were 2 companies, and now it's become 4. So clearly, Indian companies are both paying attention and doing things. And on the right hand side, you see a list of things that people are doing. This is a non-exhaustive list. There's much more people are doing. And in my conversations with companies here and outside, it's very clear that at least Indian companies for a long time have operated in care of their community. So it's not, I wouldn't say all, but most Indian companies have operated. And so things like waste reduction, things like water conservation have been things that many companies have just done as part of their DNA. But they've said, oh, but we're doing it as part of our DNA. Why do we need to be measured for it? Because investors are increasingly wanting to know if your stock or your share is a risk for me to invest in as an investor. And therefore, they have tried to create a set of standard metrics against which we can measure companies, and which I'm sure all of you know, ESG ratings are there for a result. On the next slide, what we have done is compared a set of 5 Indian companies with a set of 5 global majors. And what we have tried to do is just give a sense of how Indian companies perform on these ratings. Now, there's a whole slew of rating agencies out there. We have picked the ones that investors and a broad survey has told us are the most credible in the space. The top one is DJSI, there's Refinitiv, there's CDP, MSCI, Sustainalytics, Bloomberg, and ISS Quality Score. These tend to measure slightly different things on ESG. And so we use a basket of metrics, not just one metric, to talk about performance. But the one thing that stood out for us was there is, while you can see the colors are all over the place, you can, I think green shows you're a leader in the space, orange is a median, and red is laggard. The one thing that will stand out is that there's more orange and red on the left-hand side and green on the right-hand side. And this is a combination of performance and reporting, right? How it's well communicated. But the end result of it is that on the whole, Indian pharmacos are lagging behind the global majors. It's nothing to be alarmed about, but it is something to recognize as we think about what does sustainability for many of these companies look like. The one that I will call out is on risk management. So MSCI and Sustainalytics are ratings that take a view of how risky is a company on the basis of ESG performance. And so seeing a difference there is one of those that does kind of prompt a series of questions on how do you actually improve our performance. So we understand what sustainability in pharma operations looks like. It's ESG, environment, social, and governance. We also understand that while Indian companies are doing a lot and are making huge strides, right? We have 4 companies out of 100 globally in emerging markets are pharma companies, and Indian pharma companies. We should be proud. We also see that on some aspects of performance, we may still have a way to go as compared to global majors. So what can we do about it? Next slide, please. So what I want to present is a simple framework on how to potentially think about sustainability and infusing sustainability into your organization. It'll seem like a very basic framework, but what I want to talk about a little bit in depth is in each aspect, what that looks like and what other companies have done, which hopefully should inspire some ideas for yourselves. So the broad framework says we start with the why, and always starting with why, as Simon Sinek would say, is really kind of at the heart of a good sustainable organization. Because you always get back to the purpose, right? Why did we create this company in the first place? And what is this company for? Obviously, profit is a result of that, but what is the company's purpose in being is the starting point. And I'll come to types of purpose, because there are 2 different types of purpose, and only one type of purpose has been demonstrated to deliver profit, right? So we'll talk about that, the purpose part of it. And then purpose has to then lead to strategy, right? So what does a good strategy look like on kind of ESG? And then the how, which is how, okay, we've got a great strategy, but how do we deliver it? How do we put this into our organization so it actually gets done? So next slide, please. So let's start with the first one, which is the why. One thing we're hearing loud and clear is the dialogue on sustainability has changed. And it's not changed from just one group. It's changed from multiple stakeholders. Now, this, when I share this with my clients in India, there is always a conversation that is, this is not necessarily reflective of India. And I agree. I think this is a very global view. This is a couple of years old, by the way, and this has only been updated since. But it is a bit of a global view. But I want to call out the elements that are really relevant for us. So first is investors. The investor interest in ESG ratings has really gone up, and the fact that they are looking at non-risky ESG related investments is really, really high. That kind of relevance still holds whether you're in India or any part of the world in a globally relevant capital market scenario, especially around internationally issued debt. If you have European issued debt, for example, you should care about what your investors think, because they will be looking at this. And this is only a trend that is going to grow, and it is going to take over. So think of these as early indicators of where interest is going to come from for you to do something about this. So investors care about this. The general public cares about it, especially on topics like drugs, where if we don't get medicines at the right prices or there's price gouging, we've seen very, very public illustrations globally of what happens in those cases. Employees are increasingly beginning to ask for and want more meaning, connection. Sustainability has become a theme. Even in my own practice and hiring in India, that has gone up dramatically since in the last 2 years than 5-10 years before, and it will continue to grow. Customers are caring about it. They ask less, but especially if you have an export market, this will become increasingly a challenge, especially if there's a cross-border carbon price that is included in your costing going forward. And finally, regulators. I'm sure many of you are looking at your BRSR as something you will have to fill out the years going forward. And regulators are increasingly going to ask for more accountability on an ESG dimension. So you're going to see increasing pressure from many different sides to be more accountable on sustainability. That has already come in some instances. In other cases, it is only coming. Next slide, please. That is also being reflected in the returns. So this is from 2020, where we looked at returns index of top performing ESG companies and bottom performing ESG companies. There was a clear returns difference. But recently there was a piece of work that was done from the Stern School of Management, where they looked at ESG ratings, because there's a big question around ESG ratings. Is it real? What does it mean, etc. And they were able to truly correlate, because ESG ratings have now been around for long enough. They were able to correlate a clear outperformance by companies that were doing well on ESG performance versus companies that were not doing well on ESG performance. And there was a clear total return to shareholder difference. And that correlation is only going to increase over time. So companies, eventually investors will start looking at ESG performance as a marker of total return to shareholders and value of a company. Next slide, please. I don't want to go into this. This is a more broad definition of ESG. We've already covered what the ESG for pharma ops looks like. I want to go to the next page, which talks about when you think about purpose. The next slide, please. And what purpose looks like and how you should think about it. So we talked about the first dimension of the why as being purpose, and that purpose has to lead to a certain strategy, which is in the what. Now, when you think about where the value is created, because all this is good, but is there value to be created in this, or is this just some, nice sounding, nice clouds and fluffy clouds and strawberry pie and all that? Is that what this is about? The reality is that there is value to be created. So first, I want to talk about the academic research that differentiated between this. So about 5 or 6 years ago, this was done by an HBS professor and a Wharton professor combined to do this research. Essentially, what they were looking for was organizations that had a clear purpose. And when they had a purpose, how did they perform? Right? Is there a correlation between having a purpose and organizational performance or stock performance? What they learned was that there was no difference, that there was no correlation between purpose and performance. They said, okay, can we look a little deeper? So then they dug a little deeper, and then they found that there were two types of purpose. There was a type of purpose where people said, oh, this place has great meaning. We really believe in what this company is doing, right? So that is purpose. We really believe in what this company is doing. And we are a great community. So they call that purpose camaraderie. And there was another purpose, which is we really believe in what we're doing with real clarity about how we're doing it and what we're doing. And they realized that purpose clarity had a clear link to performance. And there was a 4% increase in return on assets, while there was no clear correlation in performance between in-purpose camaraderie. So the idea of purpose is not as a fluffy statement that we all feel good about. It is the idea of we know what we're about, and everything we do is connected very tightly to that. And the reason I talk about purpose is if ESG or sustainability is on the side, it is one other thing that you are doing, then it doesn't actually happen. Much like quality, if it is on the side and one other thing, if everybody lives and breathes quality is when quality happens. The same way, if you know what your organization is about and that's what you're doing, that's when it happens. So that is the purpose clarity. And when that happens, what you realize is there is a whole range of stakeholders who react to that. So your customers start shifting, your policymakers and regulators react as if you are a good citizen, and therefore they react favorably to what you're doing. Investors look at the kinds of practices you're performing. So just as an example, companies that in packaging, in plastic packaging, companies that create closed loop systems can command as much as a 5x higher premium than companies that don't perform that, right? And that's simply because they've incorporated circular economy, less wastage, but also lower input costs in their system. Employees are more engaged, and therefore you have lower attrition and you have lower recruiting costs. And finally, your investors will see all the benefits of this and hopefully a lower weighted average cost of capital, right? Which is something we have seen in ESG leaders versus ESG laggards. So the idea of creating a very strong purpose is that it connects all the dots and makes sure that you have a whole bunch of stakeholders that are linked in to what you're trying to do. Next slide, please. But all of this purpose and ESG, next slide, please, only happen if you are really willing to be bold. And so what I mean by that is, in all ESG work, there is what I would call the high jump. The high jump is where you have to clear the minimum ESG criteria, right? So when a regulator comes and says, look, are you doing the bare minimum on safety and on health? Yes, check, check, check. So a person comes and checks and quality audit happens, you've done it. There is a check mark, compliance part of it. Every company has to meet that, because if you don't meet that, you lose your license to operate, right? So the high jump has to be done. However, the ESG leaders are also the ones who do the long jump. They go further than others to differentiate themselves. And the differentiation, you need to leverage some kind of superpower, right? So something that only you can provide, so that it doesn't become a general CSR activity, but somewhere that you are genuinely adding true value. And I'll give you some examples of what this looks like. But I just want to land this idea that there is a minimum bar threshold crossing, which is the high jump. But if you really want to be a leader, find the few ways in which you can go further than others and differentiate yourself. A lot of clients ask me, hey, I'm such a good company. I do so many things. I'm supporting this school there. I'm supporting something else. Nobody recognizes me for it. The reality is, everybody is expected to do a bare minimum for the area that you are in. And that's kind of become the norm now. So if you really want to stand out, the long jump is important, not just the high jump. Next slide, please. So I want to give a few examples of what the high jump and the long jump, or at least a long jump looks like. Because high jump, I think you know. So I'll give you a few examples. There's a lot of examples on this page. I just want to call out a few. So on the left-hand side bottom, you'll see an example. There's a company called Maersk. It's a shipping company. And so they created the Maersk McKinney Moller Center for zero carbon shipping. And the idea of creating this group, this center, is that shipping is one of the hardest to abate sectors. You just need it. It runs on fuel. The fuel generates carbon. What do we do? And so they have created this center that is pioneering different ways of thinking about zero carbon fuels. They have gathered an entire industry consortium around it. They're working with ports. They're doing all kinds of things. But they kind of planted their flag. This is where we will leverage our superpower. Their superpower is they understand shipping. And they know shipping as well or better than anyone else in the world. And so they said, this is where we want to plant our flag. This is really what we want to do, right? On social, Unilever kind of has a purpose, which is making sustainable living commonplace. It's a very elegant thing. They basically said everyone should kind of live sustainably. And one of the things that they have called out is establishing a living wage for all supply chain workers by 2030. That is a massive undertaking because they have a massive supply chain, right? They're in multiple segments. They've got a big, very big supply network, a tier 2, tier 3 type of network around it. So establishing a living wage for all supply chain workers by 2030 is a massive undertaking, but again, something which isn't their world. It isn't there within their control, their superpower. So there's many different ways of thinking about this, but it has to connect to the world that you're in and the kinds of things that you can do. But these are examples of what bold actions look like, because bold actions energize. They go beyond, they differentiate, and they really make you stand out as against your peers, as against the rest of the sectors, other sectors that can't do probably what you can do. Next slide, please. So going from the idea of purpose to the notion of strategy. Within strategy, there is also the dimension of how are you thinking about breakouts. This sustainability is going to be a massive disruption. Now, this is not a disruption that is coming to pharma just yet. It's coming to pharma ops, and I'll come to the ideas in pharma ops in a second. But I want to give you an example from a completely different sector that has got so disrupted by this, right? Which is in the space of energy, where you'll see the three companies here are all energy, so not in your sector at all. But The black line are 3 companies that went outside the norm, completely shifted their industry in the space of sustainability changes, and where their peers are. That's the blue line at the bottom. They completely outperformed. So this is a coming trend. If you can read it early, you start to see some benefits. And if just to call out what this looks like, next slide, please. In the space that we're talking about, in the next 5 years, we believe there's something like $5 trillion of an addressable market. And many of these solutions are things that can be applied in a pharma ops setting as well, right? So, for example, whether it is decarbonization of power, this is massive. India has a 500 gigawatt renewable energy target by 2030. How can we optimize our power sourcing and therefore use more renewable energy power, right? How do we use more electric vehicles, low carbon mobility in our supply chain, in our logistics? How do we use more circular products and packaging? How can we use more recycled packaging? How do we better do water and waste management? Each of these solutions are going to come to you. There are lots of innovations in this space already that you can leverage as you start going down this sustainability path. In fact, some of these may be things that you want to invest in for your sector as well. The last thing I want to cover in this is the how. Next slide, please. So when you talk about all this, this is great. So we understand our purpose. We've got some bold strategies. Let's go to the next page, please. We've got some bold strategies. And now we've said, okay, we've got the bold strategy, but how do I make it happen? Next slide, please. And in this, there's just 5 things that companies try to do to weave or build purpose and sustainability into their organizations. And I'm going to give you these examples. I want to give you one live example that I'm working with. So the first is portfolio strategy and products. So how are your products reflecting this? So one example here, for example, is that company said that we will not sell tobacco products. Another example from a sustainability dimension is that a company said we are going to switch our entire portfolio to a green portfolio, right? So they were making products that had a carbon of a certain quantity. They said we're going to take out and we're going to make a net zero carbon product. So it's a green product. On people and culture, so how do we make sure that our diversity and inclusion numbers? So they have made a target of 30% from their current numbers, about 15%. They've said 30% is our diversity and inclusion. That's where we want to get to. On processes and systems, so they have created an entire structure around this sustain. So they have a chief sustainability officer. They put a team around them. There's teams in each of the BUs. They've created an entire architecture around sustainability to drive sustainability through. But that would be meaningless without 4, which is performance metrics. So now the performance metrics clearly target and link to ESG performance. And finally, all this is communicated externally. And they've been very clear about which organizations and associations they will be part of and which they won't be part of. For example, this example, BP said we will not be associated with certain policies, right? Or certain groups that were doing climate-associated lobbying policies. So there's some very clear things that you can do that connect to your purpose and your strategy. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the next slide, probably the next couple of slides. Yeah, just skip this as well. I just want to cover just this one and then one more slide after this, and then we'll pause for Q&A. So on this one, the one thing I wanted to call out is more and more companies are linking exec incentives, exec compensation to ESG performance. Some companies, so many companies have linked it to social, right? So you'll see on the right-hand side, 88% mentioned diversity as a metric that they've started linking it to. Again, this is a global survey. So that's happened. But increasingly what we're seeing is environment. So net zero targets and how things are working on that. Companies are starting to incentivize more. And governance around risk management, again, is going up. So this is an increasing trend that sustainability is becoming an important topic. People are seeing their compensation linked to it. People are seeing processes and systems built around it that connect to this. Next slide, please. This is the last slide I want to talk about. And this goes to the last point I said I would cover, which is how do you get started or how do you accelerate? And I just want to talk to the 4. So starting from your top left, we see a 4-step process that you can do in your organization, wherever you are, on how you think about sustainability. The first is map your world. You know, that first picture I showed you where we compared companies, Indian companies to global companies, where do you stand? What is your current performance? The good news about these ESG rating agencies is they give you a starting point on how you can compare yourself with others. We recommend looking at that and taking a first honest view on what your performance is. You will not be happy about what you see, um, not always, but it at least gives you a starting point to understand where the starting point is. Obviously, the next thing you do is from there understand what is the value at stake. And the value at stake could be a few things. It could be around the cost of capital. It could be if you have cost of debt that you need to refinance. It could be around the equity and equity interest you may get from certain investors, especially global investors or asset managers. So that is a starting point. But it also is around your broader reputation and the way that the market, including stakeholders and customers, etc., perceive you. It could be around uh, regulatory pressures or around license to operate. So there's many different ways of thinking about value at stake. But first, understanding your starting point is a very important, and taking a very honest look at it is a very important thing. So map your world, understand your starting point. Then define your contribution. Going back to the high jump and long jump, where are the real win the game themes that you're going to do? So one of our clients based in Africa is a resources company. So they had a whole range of ESG themes that came up. But the thing that they wanted to prioritize were twofold. They said, we want to participate in the economic development of the communities we operate in, and we want to operate and we want to create a green metal coming out of our mine. They said everything else we will do, and everywhere else we will do the high jump. But on these two, we want to play the long jump. And so being very clear about, because you have 100 things to do. You've got quality to do, you've got safety to do, you've got an operation to run. So you can't focus on everything. So prioritize the win the game themes that you're absolutely going to be focused on, and you're going to make sure that you've got the long jump. Once you've done that, make sure you've got KPIs set. So one of the situations that I'm working with, we have created the purpose, created commitments. Commitments have been devolved to KPIs. KPIs are now into the business plan. When you have that level of purpose clarity, then you see performance change. And so that level of purpose clarity has to be created. So that is define your contribution. Be very clear about it and run it through the organization. Then the third is embed in the business. So how do you then run that into the exact incentives also? And how do you set up a transformation process around it? Again, just to give you an example of one of the situations I'm working with, we have 600 plus initiatives that are mapped, right? And this process has been running for about 6 months now. We do a weekly meeting at a BU level, and then that gets cascaded up into a corporate level. Now you could argue why that level of intensity? That level of intensity because this is not a topic that has been looked at before at this level of seriousness. So every other topic gets precedence, this doesn't. So to create the right level of focus, you need something of a jolt. Once that jolt is created, then you implement a target operating model, right? Which is now what we're putting in place. So that is embedding it. Make sure it lasts in the business. And then finally engage with stakeholders. How good is your external communication? How good is your internal communication? Make sure that it's all translates into the disclosure and reporting that you're doing, because that is a big gap and that often shows up in your reporting and your scores. Let me pause here, and I'll hand it back, I think, to Shirish for any Q&A.